From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Coming up today, K-State's Justin Waggoner will offer advice on conducting a forage analysis for beef cattle feeding, specifically what components to analyze for to assure that that forage will be meeting the nutritional needs of the herd. Then K-State's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz will talk about saline and sodic soils that show up in certain parts of crop fields. He'll look at how those interfere with crop productivity and what can be done practically to correct them. Further ahead, K-State's Charlie Lee talks about the Antler Point Restrictions on deer hunting in Missouri that were recently evaluated for their effectiveness in promoting high-quality bucks. All this and more directly ahead on Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
For you now on this Agriculture Today, comments for you cattle producers with forage on hand for your late fall and winter feeding purposes. Knowing the content of that forage, nutritionally speaking now, is utterly important to your overall management. How to test that properly is what we're about today as we talk once again with a beef systems specialist, K-State Research and Extension, based in southwest Kansas, Justin Waggoner. Forage analysis and what one needs to know. And you get routine questions about this, you say, Justin.
Yeah, Rick, that's one of the most common questions that I think we start to encounter this time of year. And Extension as a whole has really been talking about, the value of forage testing for, probably since our inception.
Right.
Quite a while. But we still see a lot of producers may not understand what those numbers mean. And it even, really goes down to, when I submit my sample to the lab, a lot of times now we're filling out what analysis we would like over the phone or maybe doing that via the internet. And so there's a variety of different analysis packages. There's a different set of analytical measures. And so a lot of people just simply ask, what do I really need to know and what numbers are going to be the most valuable to me?
Well, let's get into what's absolute here and what may be additional options to consider. And there are what you term the basic components that are vitally needed to even start to evaluate a feedstuff or develop a ration for that matter.
Sure. And so I think the first thing that we need to be really clear about is that the whole reason that we go to the trouble of testing forages is so that we have some reliable predictor of animal performance. Mm-hmm. The gold standard of measure, in my opinion, for any forage or any feedstuff for that matter, is really going to be animal performance. From the get-go, what we're doing in the laboratory, for me as a nutritionist, is really about increasing my ability to predict animal performance. Okay, so the things that are most essential for a nutritionist to be able to sit down and do that, we need to know what the dry matter or moisture content of the forage is or the feedstuff, crude protein, and then some estimate of the energy content of that feedstuff. Now, there's a variety of different terms and measures when we can talk about those in terms of TDN, net energy for maintenance, net energy for gain, etc. Then additionally, I also recommend that we get the basic macro minerals in terms of calcium and phosphorus. And so those are really the most essential components or, the minimal things that if you sit down with a nutritionist or you work with an extension professional or an extension beef cattle specialist, that they really need to know about your forage to be able to put together a ration and build a feeding program around those things.
Now, in addition to these basics, Justin, you strongly advocate that producers look into more information that could lend still more guidance as to the management of that forage. What would those elements be?
Certainly, Eric. And so in addition to those basic components that we discussed. I also recommend that we get the detergent fiber analysis, so ADF and NDF. And really those two numbers can give us some additional information about the forage itself. So the amount of NDF in that forage essentially reflects the amount of cell wall content. So this would be the hemicellulose, the cellulose, and lignin that really make up the structural components of the plant cell wall. Now, that NDF fraction, we often think of it as being or associated with maybe the bulkiness of a forage. And so we tend to correlate that with dry matter intake of the feed stuff. So if we have that NDF number and you're working with a nutritionist, that's the number that we can use to more accurately predict how much of a given forage an animal is expected to eat. Mm-hmm. Okay. So now let's talk a little bit about the ADF number. The ADF number essentially is going to represent the amount of cellulose and lignin within the forage. And so lignin is highly indigestible. So essentially that's going to be correlated with the digestibility of the forage. So, in general, if we look at a higher ADF value, that's going to be associated with a forage that has a greater proportion of cellulose and lignin. And so that gives us an indication, well, that's probably a more mature forage potentially. And because of that association with digestibility, the ADF fraction is what we use in the laboratory to predict those energy values that we talked about earlier in terms of TDN, net energy for maintenance, and net energy of gain. Mm-hmm. The reason that's important is there's a number of different equations that we can use to calculate those measurements or estimates of energy availability to the animal.
Based on the type of forage we're talking about?
Based on the type of forage. So there would be specific equations for, say, corn silage and alfalfa hay and maybe a grass hay that would all be different. And so in some cases, nutritionists may have their own equations that they're more comfortable with. Or, it might just, we can also use equations that might be more specific if the forage maybe when it was submitted to the laboratory wasn't maybe labeled correctly. And so maybe we didn't give the laboratory the best information to work with. And that's probably a different conversation together in terms of,
right.
Forage sample submission, things that producers need to take into consideration. But having those numbers really gives you the ability to do a much better job of predicting animal performance, which is really at the end of the day what it's all about for us.
Now, there may be other special circumstances that would require of a producer other kinds of analyses. For one thing, you say, Justin, if one is feeding a forage in combination with a byproduct like wet distiller's grain, they might want to think about a particular analysis.
That's correct. If we're going to be using any of the byproducts, so dried distillers grains, corn gluten feed, etc. Early on we were learning how to use these byproducts. There was quite a few conversations about sulfur now and the sulfur content of our total diet. And it is a total diet issue, so it's not just necessarily the forage. But in a lot of times if we're going to be combining the forage that we have with a byproduct, it can be a good idea to have an estimate of the sulfur content just so we can simply calculate that overall dietary level. Now, in terms of a cow-calf operation, where those forages are most likely going to be used as a supplement, it's maybe not as much of an emphasis. But now if we take that into a growing ration where we are using a fair amount of a byproduct feedstuff in a total mixed ration, it would certainly be recommended to have that sulfur number so that we can calculate that. The other item that really kind of comes to mind, especially this time of year, is testing for nitrates. If we're dealing with a forage that is a known nitrate accumulator, so the forage sorghum, Sudan grass, etc., those would be two of the most common ones. It's always a good idea just to go ahead and submit those for a nitrate analysis if you're going to be sending those samples in as well, especially in a year where we may have had some less than optimum growing conditions, be it drought, be it a variety of situations that may have set up the potential for some nitrate issues to be there.
Test accordingly, and you did bring this up a moment ago. We won't dwell extensively on it here, but analysis is only as good as the sample that's provided, and the steps to go through in adequately sampling forage are highly important too, aren't they?
Absolutely, and I think a lot of times what we maybe take for granted in this process is, in essence, we've got, let's say, a circle of hay. We're going to bale that up. We may get somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 round bales, X number of ton of hay off of that field. Once we get that hay rolled up, we're going to take several core samples, probably up to let's say, 20% of the bales potentially that we would take core samples from, collect those, put those in a bag. When we're all said and done from that field of hay, we're essentially going to submit sometimes 2 to 3 pounds potentially of forage to the laboratory. From that 2 to 3 pounds, they're actually, for each one of those analyses, they're probably going to sample something less than a gram potentially. So when you look at it, the quality of our sample, we've got to really make sure and take some additional measures in the field to make sure that we submitted a sample to the laboratory that accurately represents what we've, harvested off the field. And so, if you put that into perspective, that we're measuring these analytical procedures at the gram level, sometimes less, and making inference to tons of hay that we're going to be feeding. It certainly makes a very good case for taking some additional moments to make sure that we take a really good sample.
Well, if one has any doubts about arriving at a forage analysis that's going to be of benefit to them, leaning on the expertise of that nutritionist, whomever that might be, sure can be helpful here.
That's right. Nutritionists, our county extension professionals, are all really good resources in terms to turn to and seek additional information. It always amazes me that, we visit with people that have, routinely sampled forages, but may or may not understand what some of those numbers mean or how we can ultimately use them. And so, I think that's maybe an important component that we haven't spent as much time on is trying to help people understand what those numbers actually mean and how we can use them to tell us a little bit more about our forages and how to feed them.
And if folks would like to review the things we've covered here in our visit today, Justin, there's an article on this topic, Forage Analysis, What Numbers Do I Need, in the latest Beef Tips newsletter out of K-State. You can access that at ksubeef.org. We appreciate your time and your comments. We'll talk again soon. Thanks, Justin.
Thanks, Eric.
Beef Systems Specialist with K-State Research and Extension. He is based in southwest Kansas. That's Justin Waggoner. We'll be back with more on this Agriculture Today.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
This is Agriculture Today, and continuing on this segment, we've information for you crop producers who may occasionally, in parts of your fields, discover that you've one of these off-colored locations that may be an indicator of saline and sodic soils, which turn up here and there. How to identify those, what's causing that condition, and moreover, what to do, if anything, to reclaim those soils in a way to make them fully productive once again. Joining us now is Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz. Dorivar, as you know, is a nutrient management specialist with K-State Research and Extension. You've just come out with an e-update article on this, Dorivar, based on a revised publication on management of saline and sodic soils. But it would be important to identify what we're talking about, first of all.
Yes, Eric. Saline and sodic soils are issues that can show up in some fields in Kansas, and we do see that in some situations. It's not necessarily something that we'll tend to see in entire fields. It can happen, and that's a situation that more often is associated with poor irrigation water and so on, that develop a high salt content in some fields that can, again, affect entire fields. But more often we'll tend to see it in small places in the field, and like you say, we're trying to improve the conditions in those areas and again, try to obviously make as productive as possible. Essentially, when we're talking about this concept, we basically talking about high salt content. That's one component for a saline soil. There are a few different types of salt that can basically cause this problem, but generally we're talking about high salt concentration in the soil. And the other component of this is the sodic soil situation, in which case we do have a high content of exchangeable sodium in the system. And both are often can be happening the same time, but not necessarily. We do have some situations where we have high salt content, more of a saline situation. And there could be also a situation where we have only more of a sodic soil and not necessarily very high salt content. And again, both can also happen in the same place.
So when you look at all of those variables, what are the ensuing impacts on crop productivity and soil characteristics, actually, Dorivar?
Yes, and you mentioned earlier the off color. That's one thing that we often notice first, and actually one of the names that we often use is alkali soils, and these are really related to that light color. So if we're looking at a field, darker soils, and suddenly you see an area with light color, that could be a situation where we have a saline sodic soil. And there are really a few key components that we have to identify there. Of course, we do need to take a soil sample, submit a soil sample to the lab to really evaluate what we're dealing with here and how severe can be the situation. But the first evaluation we do is an electrical conductivity to basically measure the salt content. And we do have a range there of values. Generally, if we're talking values of above 4 decimeters per centimeter, which is the unit of electrical conductivity, then that's the situation where we should start looking at this and see if we need to do anything to improve this situation. pH is also something that we look in this evaluation. And generally, when we're talking about very high pH, above 8.5, that could be a situation where we start to have some high sodium content, and so that's another component of the analysis. And then ultimately the exchangeable sodium concentration is something that we evaluate, and we have values above 10 or 15% of exchangeable sodium in the soil. Then we are also talking about a high sodium content. So we really look at those 3 parameters to kind of evaluate whether we have only a salt problem, a sodium problem, or maybe a combination of salt and sodium situation. So that's the first step that we need to evaluate again as we're trying to figure out what's the problem with these fields.
And when we talk about the negative consequences for crops, in all of these situations, if those levels are excessive, they can lead to issues with stand establishment, productivity, just general problems, right?
Yes, and that's ultimately the problem. And again, in those areas that we do have this problem, we tend to see very poor establishment for most crops, and a lot of that could be, again, if we're talking about high salt content, it could be early germination, seedling damage, and even some crops that start growing and just very poor looking plants basically growing in that kind of situation. And very often these plants will look like they are drought stress of some sort and just general stress. A lot of that will be due to poor infiltration of water that we have in these areas, and of course for that reason we don't have a lot of available water in the profile. But also the osmotic effect that we have from high salt content will basically generate this drought stress type situation for most crops. So those are some of the main effects, and of course we do have a range of tolerance that we see in different crops. Some crops will do better in these kind of situations versus others. Most of the crops or main crops in Kansas will tend to be slightly tolerant to salt, so that's generally positive for us. But we still, again, we can see some significant effects in plant growth and, of course, ultimately in yields if we do have problems of high salt and sodium content.
Dorivar, before we talk of the steps to follow in sampling soils for their saline or sodic characteristics, how does this condition occur in the first place? You say it often ties back to irrigation water.
Yes, in situations where we have large portions of the field or entire fields that have this situation, it could be related to poor water, irrigation water situation. So that's one thing also that we need to evaluate as we are trying to identify the source of this problem. If we are doing irrigation, we probably need to evaluate the quality of that water, and that basically means send it to the lab every so often and just evaluate what kind of salt content maybe we are applying with this irrigation water. So that's one of the main things we need to watch for. Oftentimes also just saltwater spills that we have in small parts of the field can contribute to this. And of course, those are usually more specific, and we know that the main reason for why is this happening. So there's really a combination of things that can contribute to this. And again, more often tends to be small areas in the field that can be accumulating salts for a variety of reasons.
So one has one of these spots in their fields. They're low productivity, those spots. So sampling to find out if the salinity is high or if it's a sodic issue or it's a combination of the two. What are the procedures for drawing a quality sample for testing?
Yes, soil testing will be the first step, really, and this will be very similar to what you will do for regular fertility in terms of a surface, 6 to 8 inch or so sampling depth. Collect multiple cores in the area that you where you see the problem and submit that to the lab. One thing that could be very useful to just have a better idea of the problem is to also collect sample close by where you don't see this problem. In that situation, you can do more of a comparison and see what's really showing up in those problematic areas. So that's another possibility. But certainly collecting that representative sample, the first step, submit that to the lab and evaluate the chemical characteristics of that soil. And then kind of the following steps to try and deal with this problem, of course, try to identify what's the source of this problem. If we know there's a salt issue, where this coming from poor irrigation water, is it coming from just a saltwater spill that happens one time or so on, identify that and try to deal with the problem, basically, for the long term as we're trying to fix this. A couple of options to try to improve these situations. One of the alternatives that we have is the application of amendments like gypsum that can help to move, especially if we do have high sodium content. We can basically leach some of that sodium deeper in the profile and replace that with calcium. And so that's one of the alternatives. So application of gypsum. The other component of this is that we want to have something growing in these areas, develop some amount of residue that's going to help us to have water infiltrate and basically, again, help with the leaching of this high sodium content. So try to grow some type of cover, something that's going to help us with that infiltration. That's going to be another key component as well that we need to be doing for this management. And this is, if we do have irrigation, of course, if we can add some irrigation water also to help leach the sodium with the gypsum, that's one alternative. If not, again, increasing the residue cover and increasing infiltration over time is going to help to improve this overall situation.
And you'd encourage producers to get a hold of this publication that you and your colleague, Deanne Presley, have recently revised on managing these soils. That'll be helpful.
Yes, and we do have a lot more details there in terms of specific conditions and values that we need to be looking at for when you get some of those soil test reports back as you're trying to interpret the results.
Very good. So reference that publication by title Management of Saline and Sodic Soils. It is available through K-State Research and Extension's bookstore online, bookstore.ksre.ksu.edu, or you can inquire through your local extension office likewise. Appreciate the word on this. It's one of those soil nutrient matters that maybe flies under the radar some, Dorivar, but nonetheless could be important to producers.
Absolutely.
Appreciate your time as always. Thank you for coming over.
Thank you.
He's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz, and a nutrient management specialist with K-State Research and Extension, commenting on the causes and potential responses to saline or sodic or saline sodic soils, as might be found occasionally in our crop fields around Kansas. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and we'll be back shortly on the K-State Radio Network.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128-plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Agriculture Today continues now here on the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson with you. Glad to have you aboard once again. Today's agricultural news headlines for you now, courtesy in part of DTN, starting with this week's update on harvest progress and crop conditions from the USDA for the state of Kansas. And for the week ending this past weekend, the topsoil moisture supplies in the state are at 1% surplus and 72% adequate, 27% short to very short. The subsoil moisture ratings 1% surplus, 73% adequate, and 26% short to very short. The condition of the winter wheat crop in the state, 56% good to excellent, 32% fair, 12% called poor to very poor. Planting is now 97% done. That's very near the average for the date, and the emergence is at 84%. That is behind the average of 91% for the date. Corn harvest in Kansas, pretty well on pace, 93% done now, 96% is the average. Soybeans, 91% harvested, that's right on the average. The grain sorghum harvest still running behind at 77% now, behind the average of 84% for the date. Nationally, winter wheat conditions fell slightly from the previous week, according to the USDA's report. Here's more from the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
Winter wheat planting is winding down.
95% of the winter wheat planted by November 12th, equal to the 5-year average, 1 point ahead of last year.
That was USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey.
We now see winter wheat planting complete in a number of major production states, including Colorado, Idaho, Nebraska, Oregon, South Dakota, and Washington.
He says winter wheat emergence is pretty much on schedule.
And looking at the winter wheat condition, not much change week over week. We saw a 1 point drop in the good to excellent rating from 55 to 54%. No change in the very poor to poor rating, 11%.
He says lingering drought effects are a problem. States to keep an eye on include South Dakota, Montana, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe says that Canada was the only country holding out over whether to move forward with a revised version of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, from which the United States withdrew. According to a report from Reuters, Abe said a broad agreement has been reached at a ministerial meeting, but the Canadian side said they're not yet at the stage where their leader can confirm the agreement reached among ministers. All of the other leaders are already in the stage where they can confirm the ministerial level agreement, according to Abe. Some say a deal could be announced as soon as early next year, and negotiators say they have left the door open for the United States to re-enter the pact at a later date if this country wants to. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Next for you, this week's feature for dairy producers from Animal Sciences and Industry at K-State, Milk Lines, with K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk. Mike?
Today I'd like to speak with our Kansas dairy producers concerning ketosis in their dairy herds. There's been some interesting research that gives us more insight into the ketosis problem that we might have on our farm. I know many of you understand clinical ketosis. You've had animals go down with this early in lactation generally, although sometimes it could be a little bit later in lactation. And we generally associate it either with those animals that are carrying too much condition when they calve, or maybe animals that for some other reason are just not eating as well as they could be and thus are in a severe negative energy balance. And we get into this metabolic disease. However, how about those animals that might be what we call subclinical in your herd? Recent studies indicated that maybe as much as 60% of the animals in our herd actually might have subclinical ketosis. Well, how do we measure that if they do not have clinical signs? Well, there is a metabolite in the blood that we can measure called beta-hydroxybutyrate. Also could be measured in the milk as well. So as we look at this, animals in the study that were healthy produced about 97.6 pounds of milk, while those that showed signs of subclinical ketosis produced 105 pounds of milk. And that was between 35 and 30 days in milk. Butterfats and protein percentages were also very similar between the animals. But as you look at that, the animals that were ketotic are actually producing more milk than those that were healthy or did not have an elevated level of beta-hydroxybutyrate. So what are some other factors that they found in looking at the animals in the study? Well, animals that had a body condition score of 4 or greater, about 46% of those actually developed ketosis, and those that had greater changes in body condition score from the dry period through early lactation also had a greater incidence of ketosis. For those with a score change of 3/4 of a point, actually had a 53% incidence of ketosis. For those that had just 3/4 of a point, between 0.5 and 3/4 of a point change, about 34%. So one of the interesting things about the study is we used to say that we had more than a point of body condition score change from the dry period through early lactation. We might have a problem with ketosis. I think these numbers probably convince us we need to back that down. Likely we're having more problems with ketosis in our herds than what we realize. So what do we do about it as a dairy farm owner or dairy manager? Well, number one, trying to do everything we can do to make sure that we have a high-quality ration in front of those animals every day to help them eat as much as possible so that they can meet the energy demands of the milk production that they are producing. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension.
All right, Mike, many thanks. And lastly, do want to bring to the attention once again of you beef producers that research and extension specialists here at K-State, as well as the University of Nebraska, will be hosting a series of 3 meetings in December. These aimed to help you maintain your herds on limited perennial pastures. Perennial pasture is one of the diminishing resources for operations as they're being converted to cropland or used in urban development. There will be 3 meetings scheduled to address ideas along this line. December the 12th in Marysville, December the 13th, Blue Hill, Nebraska, and December the 14th in Oberlin. All of these are evening meetings starting at 6:30. No cost to attend. Anybody interested, though, is asked to RSVP to the appropriate contact by December the 8th so that they can come up with an accurate meal count. The speakers for each of these meetings include Beef Systems Specialist with the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, Mary Drunowski. She'll be talking about thinking outside the box economical forage options for the area. K-State's own Jamie Lynn Farney will look at the do's and don'ts of cover crop annual forage grazing from the livestock perspective. And out of the University of Nebraska, Carla Jenkins on confinement cow feeding, the science and the art. You can find out more about these meetings at asi.ksu.edu. This is Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're listening to Agriculture Today. Welcome back, and again joining us for his weekly visit is wildlife specialist, K-State Research and Extension, Charlie Lee. Charlie, we're into the hunting seasons now, and before anything else today, you wanted to extend appreciation to the landowners who have opened up their property this past weekend for the upland game bird season.
Yes, Kansas has always been a very popular state to hunt small game. The opening of quail and pheasant seasons this past weekend was looked on with great anticipation, and from all reports was fairly successful. I would like to extend my thanks to landowners who allowed hunters access to their property to enjoy hunting in a wonderful state on a great weekend. The economic impact of those hunters can be significant on some of our smaller communities. In the last report done by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, small game hunters in Kansas were 283,000 hunters. They spend approximately 18 days per hunter through hunting season and spend about $1,400 in expenses. That totals to over $400 million in income that goes into those communities from hunters. So keep in mind you're providing certainly an excellent recreation opportunity for people and also helping those small business owners in your community.
And again, the upland bird season will continue for several weeks. Noting also the firearms deer hunting season will be coming up soon as well. Want to visit about that, and particularly about a regulation that's in place in our neighboring state to the east, Charlie.
Well, there's certainly a lot of controversy about Antler Point restriction when we talk about deer harvest. Missouri is one of the 26 states that implements an Antler Point restriction. That Antler Point restriction is designed to protect the majority of yearling bucks while allowing older bucks to be eligible for harvest. It's designed to allow hunters the opportunity to harvest deer that have a larger set of antlers. Whether that's a higher quality set of antlers and whether that's what constitutes a trophy in many hunters' mind doesn't matter. Many hunters want to see and have the opportunity to hunt deer with bigger antlers. So that's what this is designed to do. It's somewhat biologically sound, and that's what the goal of most state-mandated restrictions would be. But it also has to be accepted by the majority of the users, the hunters, and the landowners. This Antler Point restriction seems to have a lot of controversy. We don't have consensus of hunters, and I'm glad that we've not implemented Antler Point restrictions here in Kansas. I think hunters can do the same type of thing by conducting voluntary Antler Point restrictions. They don't have to have someone to tell them that they are not able to harvest those smaller antlered deer. If they're truly interested in managing for increased antler quality, they can do that voluntarily. After being involved in deer management for many years, I realized that the landowners are really the deer managers on the property. The state agencies do a good job of trying to manage the herd on a statewide basis, but it's the individual landowners that are providing the habitat and actually can implement whatever restrictions they want for their particular piece of property. So it's unfortunate that many hunters blame the state agency folks for some things that get implemented when landowners can certainly improve the quality of deer on their own property if they so desire.
As to what's in place in Missouri, the limitation on the hunt, there was a recent overview of just how effective that policy is?
Well, there was an overview of the efficacy of the project. It was implemented in Missouri from 2004 to 2007, and then they had a comparison from 2008 to 2013. In Missouri, it was done in 36 counties. It's interesting that though deer management programs are important when we're trying to achieve some sort of differential harvest between males and females and what some people would say would be inferior antlered deer and those that would be trophy quality, because there's lots of things that determine the trophy quality of deer, and age and antler points is certainly one of those. Nutrition is something we've talked about many times, and genetics are the three major components of a large antler deer. If you don't have good nutrition and you don't have the right genetics and you don't allow that deer to live long enough to express those genetics, then you're probably not going to have what many hunters would consider a high-quality deer herd.
The bottom line as far as this particular regulation, the desired effect, that is promoting larger, higher quality deer, just haven't materialized.
Well, they did produce an increased harvest in the male deer that were greater than 2.5 years of age, but the net harvest of antlered deer decreased because of the reduction in the yearling deer that were harvested. The areas that had the Antler Point restriction in Missouri did not increase the doe harvest as much as was desired in some parts of the state. particularly where the populations were heavy and habitat quality was very good. In an area of the state, in the center part of the state, where habitat quality was not as good, they saw some different impacts. I think the state agents should be careful when trying to implement Antler Point restrictions. They need to make sure that they monitor hunter harvest opportunities, make sure their expected results are going to meet their objectives, and keep in mind that there's going to be some hunters that are not going to be happy with being told that they may have to let some deer pass, hoping that they will live to an older age and then still be available in the population to hunt in future years.
Well, again, drawing there from an article on the effects of the Antler Point restriction policy on the harvest of white-tailed deer in Missouri. Charlie, we appreciate the comments on this. Thank you. Wildlife Specialist, K-State Research and Extension, that's Charlie Lee. So goes our Tuesday edition, and as always, we thank you for being along with us. Eric Atkinson here for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.